is a D6 generation pip. Yeah, one of those dots on the side of a six-sided die. Yeah, a pip. A short pip. Little something. About anything gaming related. Sometimes featuring Craig, sometimes featuring Russ. We'll see what's coming up today.
Hey everyone, it's Russ, solo pip time. Russ from the D6 generation, very excited to share what's been going on in our gaming life lately, and I wanted to start maybe a new segment that I might squeeze in now and then. I'm calling it Dungeon Master's Log Supplemental, inspired by Star Trek Captain's Log entries. So yeah, our big D&D campaign, the one that I've been running with my daughters, my niece and nephew, and my brother, John. We've been running this thing now. I've been dungeon mastering and DMing it for pretty much since Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition dropped. So right, the fall that came out, right when the Player's Handbook first came out, I think I shared this story that, we had a power outage here in New England, in Nashua, New Hampshire, where I live. And when the power was out, we all went to Barnes & Noble to kind of warm up and have some light. And there it was, the brand new Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition Player's Handbook. I just pulled it off the shelf and sat down with my girls at a table at the little Starbucks there. We started flipping through it, and they were in love. Almost 30 seconds in, looking at the art and the pictures and the stories and the races. And we had dabbled with role-playing games before, but I could tell they were sucked right into Dungeons and Dragons. And so right from there, that was when the campaign was born. And so we've been playing this thing since they were, like I said, about 5 years, 6 years now, whenever 5th edition came out, and I pulled off the shelf. I didn't know how long this was going to last, and I didn't want to put tons of work into creating a whole universe. And quite frankly, that's not my strength as a DM. I mean, I've DM'd a few times in the past, and my strength, I think, is just more storytelling and trying to weave the adventure together. I'm not super good at, world building, so I'd rather play a module where the world kind of already exists, and I'm just weaving the stories together and finding where the connections form. That's actually kind of what I do in my day job too. I got to figure out where the connections are. So I'm good at that. I'm less good at just ground up world building. So I didn't want to do that. So I grabbed, at that time, the brand new, just came out. It was Hoard of the Dragon Queen, which would later become the Tyranny of Dragons setting, which included the two books, Hoard of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat. So we started this thing. That came out. The DMG wasn't even out yet. And so we started. And the kids all wrote their backstories, and we got going on to it. And I've been talking about this for a long time now, and on and off on the podcast. And every once in a while, I'll hear from folks who really enjoy hearing about this. And so I thought it might be fun to share how I ran the finale. And if you guys like this, and find this interesting, let me know, and I will do some other ones about various ways I tweaked this. And the interesting thing was that the kids, my daughters, my niece and nephew, and my brother enjoyed the campaign so much, they're immediately right now working on epilogues for their characters, and they want to roll up new characters and start a brand new campaign from level 1. But we're going to do it in the same setting so that the results of this campaign are sort of there in the new campaign, right? So their former characters and people they met could have cameos in the new campaign, and the results and decisions they made, which what I liked about Tyranny of Dragons was it was so based in the Sword Coast that you could have permanent things affect the setting with a little bit of creativity from the Dungeon Master side. So you can do some things that are permanently changed in the Sword Coast based on what the party chose, which would be a lot of fun. And there's all these characters now and major politicians that the players know that I can bring forward too. So I was pretty excited about doing that. Also, other feedback I'd love to hear from you in addition to, do you like DM's Log Supplemental? If you'd also like to hear, how's the audio in this? I'm just doing a little walk. I love to hike. And so I'm just doing a walk in a local park. It's not really a hike. It's more of a stroll. But if the audio is good, I'm using AirPod Pros, the brand new ones. I feel like the audio is pretty good on this. I did some testing. And I think this is pretty good. So if this comes out okay and it's listenable and you enjoy it, let me know, because it's a great way for me to find time to record and share with you guys more. And yet It's like free time because I'm taking a walk anyway. So I want to jump ahead to the end of this campaign. Kind of spoiler alert: if you're about to play Tyranny of Dragons and you're a player, you may not want to listen to parts of this because you'll be hearing things about how the campaign could end. Now, also, I weaved a lot of things that I did special for the players in here, so some of this stuff's not directly out of Tyranny of Dragons. It's sort of my... Oops, whoa. See, I slipped there. Little audio there on me almost dying. So one of the challenges of taking a walk in the park during icy February is, it's nice and melty, there's ice all over the trail, so I got to be careful here. So you almost heard the Dungeon Master die, which would have been kind of cool. But no, not injured, not even a sprained ankle, but near-death experience nonetheless. So here we go. So, so one of the bits of feedback, and if you Google anything about the Tyranny of Dragons stuff online, you'll notice that a lot of Dungeon Masters do kind of have mixed feelings about the setting and about the module. And I think that's because it's a bit of a different sort of way to do a D&D module. So instead of it being sort of a straight up dungeon run, it's much more complicated political setting. Okay, sorry about that. So it's a very political setting with a variant. So I love the world. I love the overall story arc of the cult, but and the fact that they're trying to bring Tiamat into the world, so much full of so much classic Dungeons and Dragons iconography, right? You got dragons, you got dungeons, you got everything you need. The downside to it is that some of the encounters, some of the sections, some of the corners of the campaign, if you will, are maybe less exciting or less fleshed out as they could be, and they put a lot of work in the DM there. So I want to talk about the finale. So as I mentioned, this is the Tyranny of Dragons campaign. There are two primary sections to this thing, right? So there's the first half of the campaign, which is really Horde of the Dragon Queen. And that section is really all about the heroes discovering that there are these raids happening over the Sword Coast and that they're trying to gather treasure. There's this thing called the cult, and they're trying to gather treasure. And so the heroes really start their journey to figure out what's going on. So that's the first half. They're really building that name for themselves. And the second half, I think, is where it gets really interesting because you start to work with the Council of Waterdeep. So if you've ever played the Lords of Waterdeep board game, you'll know that the premise of that board game is you are one of the sort of the secret Lords of Waterdeep, and your resource is these little colored cubes, and you use these little colored cubes to complete adventures, and those little colored cubes represent adventurers, right? So literally kind of the back half of this campaign is your party becomes one set of those colored cubes for the Lords of Waterdeep, which is kind of a neat concept, and I really like that. And you want to have, sort of as a Dungeon Master, you're trying to build this sort of narrative around this idea that, hey, there's this feeling of this war is brewing, there's this massive council, you're trying to convince the council that they need to bring their resources to bear to fight the cult, because the cult essentially has massive armies of mercenaries and cultists, not to mention dragons this whole time. There's this giant horn blowing, summoning more and more chromatic dragons. So all that's happening, and you got to create that feeling of urgency as a dungeon master. And then also there are various stages in this sort of back half of the campaign of council meetings. So between each council meeting, the party goes off and does stuff. Hopefully those things make good things happen. And when the party comes back to the council, they report in. There's this little checklist, which is pretty cool, where you go ahead and sort of see which council members approve of the actions of the party and which council members are disappointed by those actions, right? And what's neat about that is they're trying to build support. And so this all ends in a giant crescendo, and you kind of need to know this to figure out why I did the end the way I did. It sort of ends in this giant crescendo of, okay, now it's time to go prevent Tiamat summoning. You're going to have a big showdown, which eventually the party discovers is this place called the Well of Dragons, which is a giant hollowed-up volcano where the cult has sort of elevated up the Temple of Tiamat, and they're all in there working with Red Wizards of Thay to summon in Tiamat from her prison in the Nine Plains, right? So that seems pretty cool. And so what you want to have is, A, the party have a feeling like if they did well, they should have lots of resources from these various forces affecting the outcome and involved in the outcome, and it should matter, right? So in that final battle, you have to feel like it mattered that you spent all that time running all those errands and helping convince these people to help you because you want their forces to feel like they're having an impact. But of course, you can't have the finale not really be all about the characters. So in the end, it still needs to be all about the characters. And of course, you also want to have it be very dramatic in a big sort of showdown with, of course, with a bit of luck, the mother of dragons, assuming they don't, just prevent her from being summoned. But the way the book's structured is you kind of know it'd be anticlimactic if you didn't really face her in the end. So they had this other cool thing going on there I'll get to in a second. So that's the premise. So the first problem is you got to make sure those guys all feel important. And here's where, so in the finale in the book, and I've seen other Dungeon Masters when I was putting pictures up of what I was doing and kind of hinting at it was the big finale. I know DMs already reached out to me and said, hey, I was kind of uninspired with exactly what was described in the book. And so what's described in the book is they give you sort of a mini dungeon run to do prior to getting to the temple. So the idea is like, hey, here are the forces of the cult defending the Well of Dragons. It just lists a bunch. And then it says you may or may not have these forces to help you, depending on how you do with the council, right? Because there's like 8 or 9 members of the council. There's elves, there's dwarves, there's various political factions from Waterdeep. There's Coromir and the Purple Knights. So if you're familiar with the Sword Coast, you probably know all the players. And so it's really interesting to see how, it seems like a cool concept, right? But then how do you execute it in such a way that it matters? And then the second part is then party, meanwhile, while that battle's going on somewhere outside, the party's supposed to be infiltrating and getting into the temple and everything else. So I had this sort of challenge, and they don't really tell you how to do it, except for giving you the map of things the party could run into on the way inside. You don't really give you a challenge. The other thing I've discovered playing with my players is that they really enjoy giving a tactical challenge. So they like to they don't like just like a straight up dungeon run where you just walk through a dungeon and you take a left and all of a sudden there's a monster to fight, and then you take a right and there's a trap, and you take a left and there's another monster to fight, and there's not really decisions being made as much as there's just like, should I have remembered to tap with my 10-foot pole for the past 20 feet and that kind of thing, which I get, right? Like that's kind of really, it's fun, but it's, it does get old. And then pretty much if that's all you ever do in D&D, then of course it gets sort of samey right after a while. So I found always that it's been much more fun to say like a situation like, hey, meeting in this tavern. Maybe you're trying to get this, assassin. Before you go in, you start scouting the tavern out. You see that they've got 2 guys on the roof. You see they've got 3 guys look suspicious inside the bar. You see one of the maids doesn't look like she knows how to serve very well. All of a sudden, the party is figuring out it's an ambush, and they try to react accordingly, maybe ambush the ambushers. I love that kind of a thing, right? So I was like, well, how can I make this happen? How can I make it feel like they have these armored resources? So I did a few things. I used a little bit of technology. So I'm going to go through that with you guys, but mostly I spent time thinking about how I would tackle this. How did I want the players to feel, right, as we did this? So first, a word about technology. So one of the things I discovered that I really liked, I made a switch. So longtime listeners may remember that I used to use RealmWorks came out right about the time I started this campaign. So I used RealmWorks quite a bit to manage all my information. RealmWorks is by a company called Hero Lab, Wolfslayer. They do Hero Lab, an army builder. And I did really like that software a lot. I used it quite a bit. In fact, in many ways, I miss using it because it was so good at organizing all that information. But what I found I really wanted, though, was I wanted a way. So one of the things you guys should know about how I play, we play in person currently. And I generally like to use sort of a battle board of some kind in front of me. I have actually the tiles that interlock. So the grid tiles, that pop in and out, dungeon tiles. So I like those a lot because you can shape the image any way the battlefield any way you like. And you can draw right on it to make pretty much any situation. And I like to use a few miniatures here and there, but generally we have cool painted miniatures for the party members. And unless it's a major battle, the foes are usually represented by number counters or something. So I can easily say, hey, are you attacking kobold number 5? They say, yes, you get it, right? But also, behind where I sit, there is I happen to play in the family room. So behind me, behind where the Dungeon Master sits, is a large television. And so what I'll try to do is put something on the television that's interesting to the players. And after a while, I started having some ideas about what I should put up there. So initially I would put up there inspirational pictures. So like if you're going into the misty woods or a dungeon deep, I got a picture of like maybe a dark castle or the misty woods or something, right? And it adds some atmosphere, which is great. Then though, Realmworks started adding capabilities to actually have a player's view of the map, and you could gradually expose the map. So what I would do is for larger battles or larger engagements where I was trying to show multiple things happening, maybe I show a bigger picture of the city area, and on the table would be where the players were fighting, but maybe on the larger map, I could start showing what else was going on, right? So if a town was being raided by the cult, they might be having the middle of the battle on one of the streets. But up on the picture, I could show that at the north side of the town, there's an army getting closer, and on the south side of the town, there's this problem, and the guards are yelling for help. And it gives that feeling of like a larger thing happening, even though you're focused on the miniatures on the table. So I was combining sort of the digital map with the activity on the battlefield to sort of the near and more global feeling. It also allowed that when a quick battle was done, let's say there's a city being invaded and there's a quick fight in one street, and then the party decides to run up and go take a right and two left to get to the other place there's a problem, you have the big map behind me showing where all those things were, and we could move like a party marker on the map really quickly, and then we would zoom in onto the battlefield represented in 3D on the table and actually show how the fight worked out. We could worry about, exact location and all that kind of stuff. And that worked really well in those scenarios. The other thing I discovered was that when I got into the second half of the campaign, though, where there was going to be these council meetings, I kind of wanted to have something on the screen behind me that made the players feel like they were in a council, and that I could show sort of the expression of the council members changing. And again, this is all going to come back to the finale, so hang on me. And I felt that Realmworks couldn't really do this. So Realmworks was really good at like showing a map and where you are on the map very specifically. But I wanted sort of the capability. I was experimenting with PowerPoint and other tools to try to do this. And that's when I stumbled upon, I don't even remember which con I was at. It might have been Gen Con. It might have been one of the PAXs. I don't know. But I ran into the Roll20.net guys and started asking them about it. And what I liked about their virtual tabletops, there's lots of virtual tabletops, and I happen to use Roll20.net now, but there's a ton of them, and they're all great. So I'm not trying to, they're not a sponsor. I'm not trying to push anything with them. But what I've discovered about these other virtual tabletops is instead of just showing a map, you can really show anything. You can make any object on there a token, and you can drag it around, put status symbols on it, change its color. And so I was like, wow, if I had this, and I created each council member sort of like a really cool picture of like, so if the party's standing in front of a council of like 12 people, and I have each of their giant, cool art faces up on the screen, and they're all represented as tokens, and I could put little color icons next to them to indicate if they're happy or sad, sort of like, angry or happy meter. They get this feeling, they'd be constantly staring at the screen and reminding themselves they're standing in front of a council of 12 people. The players can all see the names, so when they're role-playing, they don't have that constant, like, what was the dwarf's name again? And so it really added some of that to it. So I've been experimenting with the entire back half of the campaign, and the players really got into it to the point where one of my daughters, like, the council meetings are my favorite part, because it's pure role-playing. I can see what's going on, and it's just really cool. So that worked out really well. So I definitely would say, and it's interesting because Roll20.net and the other virtual tabletops, their pitch really is that it's great for playing when you're remote. So what I found is, and I'm sure that's true, and the secondary part of this is my daughter's getting ready to go to college next year, and so I definitely wanted to start using some tools that would allow us to still be able to play when we were apart. But what I was really impressed by is that with a television behind you and one of these tools, and all you do, like Roll20, I have 2 accounts. The Dungeon Master has to be the only person that pays for the account. So I have an account that I pay an annual fee, I don't remember, it's not very much, for, so I can have all the information in front of me. The other thing really cool about Roll20 is they have a super deal with Wizards of the Coast, so that pretty much all the needed content is available there. You pay for it, you download it, it's all built right into the tool. The monsters are all there, the artwork's all there, the module information's all there. Oh my God, it's so simple. And again, as someone who doesn't have a lot of time to do prep work, I really like this. You don't have to buy it. You can build it all yourself if you have the hard copy version. I'm going under a bridge, a highway right now, so you might hear some cars in the background. But I found it to be very, very effective. All right, so fast forward to finale time. So I've figured out this tool now that allows me to have sort of an overview or a non-battle type bit of information behind me on the screen. Whether it's a council or a larger city, I can capture that. Meanwhile, I've still got my, tabletop in front of me. The players are sitting around with miniatures and all of our years of miniature experience. to really be able to paint a really cool zoomed in picture of whatever's happening. So the epiphany came sitting there trying to figure out how to do this was, well, what if on the screen behind me, I had sort of like a giant aerial photo of the Well of Dragons, right? And I created icons for, or tokens, essentially, virtual tokens for all the defending forces. So when you look at the map of the Well of Dragons that's included in the module, you'll see that it's a giant hollowed up volcano. This thing is massive, and there are entrances all around it. So there's like 5 or 6 entrances total, some are on the north, some are on the east, some are on the south. It's so big, too, that it would take a while for an army to get from one side to the other. So it's like if I could set this up on the screen behind me and disposition the enemy forces there, the players could disposition their own forces that they received from the council around it, and we could see that on the screen behind me of kind of like that battle and how it was matched up while they were playing and fighting their way either to the temple or inside the temple right on the tabletop in front of me. And I was thinking, well, if I do that, and then I was thinking, well, if I do that, then we can definitely have that feelings going on, but I have to have it feeling like it's happening every round. So I also use software for initiative tracking. So in the initiative tracking software, if in addition to having all the characters in there and all the enemies in there, I also put in one row for sort of like the armies of the council, if you will, the good guys, then when that row came up, we could go back to the bigger map and show how that fight was going, right? And I was like, well, how can I do that? And so I ended up going to this place. I ended up having behind me, well, I did 2 things. First of all, remember I mentioned that my party and the players love to like sort of plan the battle. So I set up a thing. There's also this, before the final battle, sort of the last chapter of the module, there's a previous chapter. There's this previous chapter right before the main final sort of scene there at the Well of Dragons where the heroes end up going to Thay. And the interesting thing about the Stay mission is, and everybody universally thinks it's silly, is it sucks. And the way it's written in the module is sort of weird. It is simply they go there, they basically have a bad dream, and they come back. And it's not entirely clear the value this adds to the overall plot of the story, except for there's this one sort of Red Wizard character. Well, we know the Red Wizards are working with the cult to summon Tiamat using their summoning skills. That we know. So there's that, and there's this one character involved that's kind of important, but it's very light, it's very weak. So instead, I tweaked it to say if they could get this person back. I had some other things happen there too, and maybe in a future version of this, I'll talk about what I ended up running for the Thay mission, because I actually made it kind of a big deal, because I wanted the characters to see what Thay was like and see it was very different than the Sword Coast, blah, blah, blah. But long story short, by rescuing this person or retrieving this person from Thay, because of her innate connection with the summoning process, she could actually scry the exterior of the Well of Dragons and know exactly where the cult was and where their forces were dispositioned. And this MacGuffin, this plot trick, if you will, I liked because it would give me an excuse to give characters sort of, and the council essentially, good knowledge of the disposition so they could plan their attack. And it would basically allow them to have that moment of feeling like, I am the commander of this massive army that I've been spending this entire sort of campaign trying to convince them to help me. Now I can assign those forces and do something interesting with them, right? So I wanted to give them this feeling of like, yeah, we're working with the commanders of Waterdeep to figure out how to do this, right? So I had this big scrying moment where I described what it looks like. I showed the dragon masks being merged. I tried to paint this sort of cool word picture. I'm not sure how I did, but I tried. But also, I threw up on the screen, like, here, you're seeing now, here's where the Well of Dragons looks like, and here's where the forces currently are. And during the scrying, I had a druid stormtrooper there make a little stone model in real time of what they could see. So basically, at the final council meeting, they had this, like, stone model of the Well of Dragons, along with typical force dispositions and force numbers. So in that final council meeting before the battle, they could decide how they were going to bring the forces there and disposition them, right? So that was the thing. I won't get into details of how they dispositioned them and how they got there. They used Skyreach Castle, a bunch of other things, and pocket dimensions to get all the troops on Skyreach Castle. Really fun story about that. One other MacGuffin I put in there was that in my version of this, the Drac Horn, which was this really powerful horn that begins sounding halfway through the overall campaign. In the default story, the Drak horn simply is summoning this massive horn blown by air elementals, and it's summoning all the chromatic dragons, right? Which is why they're all flying around the Well of Dragons defending it. So you have this problem where not only do you have to have ground forces to counteract the Well of Dragons forces, so the characters can slip in, they can't just fly right into the center because there's these massive clouds of essentially chromatic dragons flying around and defending it. Now, my party did strike a pretty good alliance with the metallic dragons, so they had the metallic dragons on their side to counteract them. But I decided to make things even more interesting, and so I made it so as long as the Drak horn was blowing, which in the book they described as blowing like almost every so often, every few hours, you can hear it pretty much anywhere in the sword coast. So it's this massive horn that everybody can hear, and it's constantly summoning dragons. I also started doing this thing throughout the campaign where dragons were one size bigger than they should have been. So, this dragon that you may have met earlier who was like a young adult was now an adult. Or if you met an adult, he was now the size of an ancient. He was still an adult, but he was the size of an ancient, and his powers were kicking up. So basically the Drak horn was amplifying the powers of all the chromatic dragons. So it meant as long as the Drak horn was glowing, that meant that the chromatic dragons would have an advantage in combat over the metallic dragons, even if their numbers were equal, because they had powered by this horn. So it created this need. Now, it turned out also, which is cool, is that at the Well of Dragons, that's what the Drak horn is. So it created this need for a strike force or somebody to get in there and silence the Drak horn, which would give them a shot then at pushing back air superiority of the chromatics, which would allow them then maybe to get their party to be able to fly over. If the chromatic dragons could be held back by the metallics, or at least distracted by the metallics pretty severely, then the party was thinking we could then allow the players to actually go ahead and airdrop right in to the temple maybe and avoid having to do like dungeon crawling, so they could get in fresh against whatever was going on in the temple, which I thought was a brilliant idea. So they dispositioned all their forces. They got all that done. They had this big plan. One other thing that was kind of fun was that I tried this experiment early on in the campaign, or maybe midway through the campaign. I think I shared it on the show, where I kind of wanted to establish some cool backstory. So one day I just asked the characters to roll up a bunch of I think it was that time level 5 alts that were all Harpers. And so I did this flashback adventure where they actually went in and were doing an older adventure. They did this adventure where they saw the cults finding and stealing the Drak horn for the first time. And they were all Harpers, and they almost stopped them, but they didn't. And so that's sort of this backstory. So they had this group of Harpers, always that had been out there. They did this little side adventure. And initially when we ran it, they thought it was neat, but they didn't like spending a whole session where their mains didn't get any XP, so they were kind of sad about that. So I was like, because originally my thinking was, well, we run this backstory, and then there'll always be these Harper characters out there, and maybe occasionally we could go ahead and back in and have a side adventure, so there'd be this constant feeling of all these little adventures happening and all these little missions going on, whether it was the mains or the sides, but they didn't really like the idea of doing a side adventure that didn't actually directly impact the story. Well, we did do it once, and it was pretty neat. And I did actually end up weaving back some of those characters back in a little bit periodically throughout the story as sort of like NPCs. But what came to them was, so at the end of the final assault, they did have access to Harper agents and others to help them do other things. And so in addition to signing those really big army forces against the main forces of the cult, they had these couple of covert forces they had worked with in the past, including the Harpers, as well as they had made a deal with the Black Network, the network of assassins and spies, to get their help too. So they had these sort of like covert forces they could also allocate. And so they decided, well, we got to stop this Drak horn. So maybe there's a way we could first, and they did, thanks to their really good scrying rolls, they did find this little sort of entrance that wasn't well guarded. So they thought they could send in the Harpers and the Black Network in as sort of like SEAL Team 6, if you will, in there and take out the Drak horn. Meanwhile, their main characters, they would land their castle, they would deploy their forces, characters would stay on the castle in sort of this cloud form the Druid could cast that can move super fast. They'd wait until they heard from the strike force that their alts, right, their Harper strike force, that they had taken out the Drak horn. So this made it really cool because they could play their alts one more time at the end, and they were actually, there's a battle that mattered, right? So they got to play their alts who were under leveled. I let them level from 5 to like 8 now, but they're still way under leveled for this scene. But they had a bunch of like, basically fodder with them. So they had a bunch of Harper agents with them, and they had a few, unnamed NPC assassins with them all running through. And so they made it in there, and they lost a few unnamed guys here and lost a few unnamed guys there. And it was great because of the final battle for the Horn, they were down just to named folks. And I had a couple of folks with them who were well known from the council. So Rumelia Haventree, who's the head of the Harpers, was with them in her battle armor. And there's a really cool picture of her in the back of the new collector's edition of Tyranny of Dragons. So she was with them. I had some other folks from the Black Network there that are kind of outlined in some of the Waterdeep fluff. So like Black Viper was with them, and John the Gleam Silver was with them, who was a character from earlier in the campaign. So there's this moment where they were all doing their thing. They almost got defeated by a really powerful character, but they ended up silencing the Drakhorn, and it went down. So that was kind of cool. And then they cut back to the main characters on the castle. They heard the horn stop, but also the wizard in the party has a spell called Raries, which allows them all to have a mental communication link between a certain number of characters. So the party all had Raries up, but also they connected it to Renee Haventree, so she immediately mentally sent back the horns down, go, 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 and they launched. They also had, which was cool, they created messenger stones for all the major commanders of all the forces. So it was almost like they had communication. So it was like they had comms with these messenger stones, which basically allowed you to send little mental tweets to each other. So they had these messenger zones set up between all the major commanders of the forces. That would allow me then a fluff reason for why the characters could know how the army forces were doing everywhere, and they could sort of still be in touch with them. So it gave them this capability to kind of know there's this big battle going on outside. So that all happened. They went for the horn, and now the main character's plan was they were going to try to fly fast and true and get to the main temple and fight there. And the wizard had already told me that they were going to land as high as they could on the temple. He was going to pass wall in, and they were going to drop right in on the temple. Now, this was actually great to hear because it simplified a lot of the final battle. And what's also great is that the way this happened to play out was it played out in 2 sessions. So session 1 we did was the alt characters going for the horn, and the characters' party telling me how they were going to make their final assault on the temple. And then we stopped that day, and that gave me time to figure out how I was going to do the final battle inside. And so when the final battle inside occurred, and you can see pictures of this online, the way the temple is laid out is pretty interesting. And again, I like tactical challenges for the players. So what I really liked about the temple presented a really interesting tactical challenge for the players, but only if you could figure out a really good way for the players to understand what the heck was going on inside this temple. So it's going to be hard. I'm going to try to verbally describe it to you, but it's tricky. And it was even tricky for me to put up on my screen, because on my screen behind me, I really wanted to show how the outside battle was going. So for the screen behind me, what I wanted to do was have an icon, a cool art for each of the major armies that were fighting, with armies of good, along with them, have them on a sliding meter. And I was able to use Roll20 for this. I created the meters in PowerPoint and then cut and paste them into Roll20. And so there's basically a picture of each army, and there's a picture of this on Twitter and Facebook if you want to check it out. But I showed a picture of each army, and I had a slider from good to bad, like how, whether they're winning or losing. And then to right of the slider, I showed the force they were facing, and I put a DC next to that force, a difficulty check number they had to beat in order to have the army advance one towards the winning side. And if they failed that roll, they would advance once towards the losing side. And then to the right of that, I put a few bonuses that were in place to their die roll based on how they did the matchup. So for example, if they were cavalry fighting against infantry, they would have +1 for like force type advantage. And if maybe there was a hero with them, so if there was like a hero with them, that hero might give them an additional +1, one of the major members of the Council of Waterdeep. Or if it was dwarves fighting giants, well, maybe they have an advantage for fighting against giants. Or if you have treants involved, you put treants against regular, things like that. So all these bonuses on the right. So when it got to that initiative step, remember I have an initiative step in there for the armies of the council, we'd go to the screen and I have the players actually roll for each of the army forces to see if they succeeded or failed and moved up or down on the meter. And if they got really far along the meter to the victory section or beat the roll by a natural 20, they might move twice, or I might create a special campaign event. So for an example, they had the paladins of the Order of the Gauntlet going in to try to rescue certain prisoners and stop the prisoner flow. The cult was sacrificing these prisoners they captured for powering up the summoning ritual. They did happen to roll a natural 20, so they found some specific prisoners that the party knew, rescued them, but also stopped the flow of prisoners as well, which further weakened Tiamat. More about that in a bit. So I had that figured out behind me, but I needed to figure out a way to represent this entire temple then. So behind me, there's all the meters and figuring out how the big battle's going, and I finally got a way to figure out how they could feel like there is tons of great, war raging on outside of the well, which is cool. Then what I needed was a way to actually represent the entire temple. Now, the interesting thing about the temple is, I'm going to try to describe this. The temple is massive. First of all, it's way too big to fit on a typical table if you actually use the scale described in the book. So the scale, if you look at the picture in the book, or if you Google, Well of Dragons, Rise of Tiamat, you will see, I'm sure there's art of this all online, but you'll see that these squares represent 10 foot instead of the typical 5. So you need to double the size of it. So it's 40 squares, roughly 40 by 40 1-inch squares wide, but it should be doubled. So it actually should be 80 inches by 80 inches roughly. And the problem with 80 inches by 80 inches is that won't fit on most tabletops, right? Not even close. So you either need to do something. Now, I didn't want to, of course, one option is to scale down, right? So scale everything up and everybody use different miniatures or something, but I didn't want to do that. And quite frankly, I felt that 40 by 40, so if you just changed the squares to 5-foot squares instead of 10-foot squares as pictured, it still felt massive and awesome because now it's a 40. And actually, the way I ended up doing it was a little slightly bigger than 40 because I was able to, using my interlocking grids, I was able to build it in sort of interesting shape. And again, there's a picture of this in our Twitter feed so you can see it, but I was able to build it in such a way that I had plenty of space to get roughly 45 by 45. So still, very big layout. So anyway, so you have this giant star-shaped sort of first floor, if you will, of the temple. But the problem is the temple is very tall. But the interesting thing about this temple is there are not multiple stories. So if you look in the picture in the art of the book, what you will see, if you look in the art of the book, what you will see is that there is actually another level above. So remember, the base of this is sort of like a star shape, 5 different corners, and each of the alcoves basically of this giant shape are colored to match one of the heads of Tiamat, right? Because Tiamat's temple, which makes sense. So you've got these 5 different areas: red, green, blue, white, black. Then though, there's another level above that, but it's not really a level. It's just that the towers go up, and at this 50 feet high in each of those sort of alcoves, right, is a wizard floating, one of the wizards of Thay, doing the summoning. So each alcove, at ground level, there's a wizard, and then 50 feet up, there's a wizard. And then in the center of this whole thing, right, instead of being 50 feet up, at the center of this, 100 feet up, is Severin, the main of the Cult of the Dragons. He's wearing the assembled mask, right? And he is flying 100 feet up in the air. They are also working on summoning Tiamat. So basically you've got essentially 10 summoners, right? One on the ground floor in each of the corners of the alcoves of the star-shaped temple. And then 50 feet up, you have floating above there another 5 summoners. And then in the center of the temple, 100 feet up, you have the main bad guy, at least it's the main bad guy as far as the cultists go, Severin, flying above there as well. So it's a very 3-dimensional thing. Now, if you imagine this in your head, oh, by the way, and then in the middle of the temple, right in the center, sort of hovering in the center, is this giant portal that's forming as they summon, which is where Tiamat's going to come out, right? So you've got this big thing happening in the middle. Now, I felt like, okay, since this is the final battle, and, I'm a miniature gamer, I feel like it's worth putting the extra time in to really make this thing sort of like crazy cool, right? Like really look awesome on the table. Plus, if I could make it really look cool on the table, that would allow the players to understand what's going on there and to give them some really interesting tactical options. Because if you think about the size of this thing, they're all 14th level players, right? Now there's 5 of them, they're 14th level. 14th level characters, they kill stuff fast. I don't care I don't care what you put out there, unless it's like 500 hit points, they can drop it. Things that are around 100, 150 hit points, they can drop really, really quickly. So, but when it's that spread out, right, in this giant star-shaped pattern that's 45 inches wide, so that would be a tactical challenge too, but plus also the height thing. So not everybody can fly well. So how do you fix that problem, right? Because not all the players can fly. And that's interesting also. So I thought this was really cool. So how do you solve this problem? So I started thinking about how the heck can I represent this on the table? So the first thing I did was I was like, well, I want to have cool models for everybody. So I had already, I think listeners know, I'd already bought the a giant model for Tiamat because she'd be coming at some point, probably. So that would be cool. And so I was excited about that. I had her covered. I also bought some of the Gale Force 9 actual Rise of Tiamat miniatures. So I had Severin, I had Wrath Mordor, who's the leader of the Red Wizard Summoners, so I had them covered. What I was missing was all the Red Wizards of Thay that were doing the summoning. And so I shopped around. They're hard to find bald wizards, but I ended up going with some GW models that actually were a bunch of bald guys wearing sort of some basic sort of ornate robe bits, like their chests were generally exposed. So I decided to paint them up like red wizards. They already had some tattoos on the model, so they were great. So I did those up. So I had 10 of those guys. So now I had all the summoners models done. I also had models for any bad guys that would be help defending the area. So the worm speakers were there defending. So that was all set. But what I was missing was, how do I handle the height problem? So I was like, well, if I had transparent acrylic that I could use to show the height, I could have it look like the models were floating. So I went to Amazon, and sure enough, I found that there was acrylic, 1-inch diameter acrylic tubes that you could get exactly in 10-inch lengths. And this was fantastic because each of the wizards is supposed to be 50 feet off the ground, and in Dungeons and Dragons, standard 1 inch is 5 feet. So a 10-inch acrylic tube is 50 feet off the ground. Now, to get this to not fall over all the time, I also would need a base for it. So I also ordered a couple of, I think they were 2-inch by 2-inch, may have been 3 by 3. They might have been 4 by 4. I think they were 4 by 4. I should measure them, but I got a bunch of acrylic squares. So clear acrylic squares, about 1/4 inch thick. So they were nice and rigid. And I simply glued these acrylic squares, also available on Amazon, by the way. I simply glued these acrylic squares to the top and bottom of the acrylic tube. So now I could put this thing on my tabletop. The bottom of it was clear, so the guys could, you could still see the grid underlying it on top of my dungeon tiles, so they weren't blocking any real movement. And then I could have literally floating, 50 feet in the air. It was a little platform I could put a miniature on, which would represent the summoning battle mage. Which is really interesting about this, though, is then I was like, I kind of like that the idea that they're standing on invisible force tiles, like invisible tiles of force. Either they're maybe like they're casting a wall of force up there, or maybe there's some kind of special magical levitation going on. But I just like this idea that the wizards weren't making themselves fly, but instead they were standing on these floating tiles, and that would be cool. And plus I was like, well, wouldn't it be cool if the tiles were sort of free floating, and if they were given a push, they would move? Because then I was like, that's just another cool tactical option for the players, right? Because if they can get up there and they can somehow figure out a way to create force, like a thunder wave or something like that, you can sort of be scooting around, floating around in the air. And wouldn't that be a cool sort of option for the players? So for me, D&D isn't really about it is about like combat and fighting, but it's really about creating these crazy tactical options that then players can exploit and use, and creating fun moments, right? Fun cinematic moments. And so I thought the idea of players floating around these little tiles could be pretty interesting. So I decided to make those all tiles floating. So again, that idea came just from the act of creating some kind of way to create these guys floating up. So I ended up having to end up making 6 of these sort of, 10 high platforms out of clear acrylic, one for each of the corners of the star, because that's in each of those there was a 50-foot high, a wizard summoning 50 feet high off the ground was doing their summoning thing. And then below them was another wizard summoning. But then I needed a 6th one because the party said they were going to land on a high point on the outside of the temple and then pass wall in. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I took one of these things and made it, essentially 50 feet high as well, coming in from the outside, so the party could start also on their own little platform, but instead of this being a clear floating force plate, it would actually be sort of a ledge outside. And so I took one of my dungeon tiles and put it on top of this thing, and that's where the party would come. And I would move it around on the table wherever they decided to enter the temple. So they could pick whichever side of the temple they wanted to come in on. And I would arrange this thing so they would be entering from that point, looking into the temple through their pass wall, and they would see this crazy open-air sort of cathedral situation with all these floating wizards around, right? Now, the last part of the puzzle was, how do I handle the giant portal in the middle and Severin 100 feet off the ground? Well, so if 10 inches is 50 feet, then 20 inches is, of course, 100 feet. So again, I went back to Amazon and I found, well, this clear tube thing is working. And I couldn't find a clear tube that was 100 feet long, but I found a clear square that was 100 feet long. So it's like basically a 100-foot long column, but instead of being round, it was a square. This turned out to be an advantage. So I got that, and I glued my little acrylic plates to the top and the bottom of that. So now I had this giant, 20-inch tall thing in the middle of the table, also clear. I could put my Severin model on top of that, and now he's to scale 20 inches off the ground. The other thing this did was it made it awesome for measuring ranges, because you're going to have this combat in a giant three-dimensional space, which you almost never do in Dungeons and Dragons. And how the heck can you check range when you're firing diagonally up and down, from 50 feet up and everything? Well, it turns out if you flip over and think about how you would do it in a miniature war game, if I just pull out a tape measure and I measure, the diagonal distance between someone on the floor of the temple up to one of the people floating, that's going to give me the distance in inches, multiply that times 5, and you can see if they have range, right? So we really went that route. So that thing is now floating in the air. Now the last problem is, how do I handle the portal? And so this one, I actually have to thank the listeners out there, you guys, and the folks who follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Because what happened was I couldn't figure out how to build this thing there. So I was having trouble figuring out, how am I going to represent this portal? And so I started asking folks. So first I Googled it, and nobody makes a portal that is the right scale. And I wanted the portal to feel like that my giant Tiamat model could fit through, right? So a gigantic dragon, like a gargantuan dragon model, has to be able to fit through this thing. Who's got anything that looks like that? And so I went online and started asking folks on Twitter and Facebook, and someone said, a lot of different suggestions, great ideas. Someone said, what about the webway portals from Games Workshop? And I was like, holy crap, that's perfect. Because A, they're vertical, B, they're split, so they're two pieces, and C, they are really tall, because GW has all those crazy, giant constructs that can come through them from the Eldar, and so they're really, really, really tall. So I ordered those. This was a little bit expensive for what I was doing, but at the same time, it's the D&D finale. We've been doing it for 5 years. How many times do you get to do this, right? So I ordered those, and so I pretty much built them as they recommend in the box by the instructions. The only change I made was, if you know the Games Workshop Eldar webway portals, they sort of are built in this way. There's these very stylized sort of like Eldar figures on each side, but they their head, the Eldar heads, are separate pieces you put on. So I just didn't put them on, and instead I went out and found some old dragon models I'd never used, cut the heads off, and glued them on where the Eldar heads would be. So he ended up looking like this thing. Again, there's pictures online. It ends up looking like this thing where there's his giant sort of curvy portal with two dragon heads off the side of it, which gives it a little bit of a draconic look, which is exactly what I was going for. Just prime the whole thing black, a little bit of dry brushing, boom, it's done. And so because there's this giant 100-foot tall, 20-inch tall clear pillar in the middle, I could put either of the webway portals on the opposite side of this clear pillar, and now they're framing it. And I was like, well, he needs like a giant glowing circle. I was like, wait a minute, I have those. So I have some of those spell template tokens. Those clear plastic, kind of rigid spell template tokens that are floating around. Like there's one that's 10 inches wide for ball and whatever. So I got one of those, and I just taped it sideways onto the pillar. And so what ends up happening is you have this giant circular colored circle thing sort of like floating between the two webway Eldar gates. And I loved the look. I was like, oh, that's perfect. So I figured it out. So I had this giant portal in the middle. I had Severin floating high above it, 20 inches off the ground. And I had each wizard floating 10 inches off the ground, which would be 50 feet in the corners. And it all fit on my table. And so, I had the armies behind me, on these meters showing how they would be doing. I had the tabletop in front of us showing a really clear picture of how this three-dimensional temple fight was going to look. And I've never personally had a three-dimensional sort of, that level of three-dimensional battle in Dungeons & Dragons before. So I thought that uniqueness of that would really give a strong sort of like, wow, what a crazy finale epic battle that would occur there. So I won't share the actual results of the actual battle and how it went in terms of story, because I think I'll share that in a future episode, and I think I might see if I can get my daughters to join me or some of our players so we can share some of their thoughts. But I will say that I was super pleased with the amount of when they were flying to the temple. What I did was I had taken all the three-dimensional stuff off the table, and I had rolled out a mat covering up the pre-done sort of dungeon tile that had drawn the temple on it. So I covered it all up. And so they came in, we had some prep work to do. They had a little preliminary story. The Drakhorn battle part just finished, and they were getting ready to fly with their main characters. And I said, okay, everybody, and they chose a part of the castle to attack. They landed on the outside of it. I said, okay, everybody go upstairs, and I'm going to set up what you see in a second down here. And I was pleasantly surprised by the level of excitement and just impressiveness, I guess, that it had, which is really what I wanted. I was hoping to get that level of impact, really like, wow, this is an epic conclusion to this campaign, and being able to track behind us on the screen how the battle was going outside. They were really vested in that. The other thing I did for that battle outside was I allowed the players to use inspiration. So I let any player they would choose to roll for whichever force they wanted outside, and one of the armies, and I would let them spend their inspiration on it. I was giving inspiration out like candy during the battle inside the temple. So I would tell the players, like, if you can give me good one-liners, if you can give me good sort of fluff behind what you're doing, and really sort of like monologue a lot, I'll throw inspiration at you, because I knew they needed inspiration to make those rolls outside strategic and not just like a random dice roll. So they were choosing. What ended up happening was not all of them got inspiration every round, because they would forget to do a cool line, or they would just do one that was kind of lame, like, here I am. It's like, no. And you couldn't use like, it's over Annie, I have the high ground either. You have some really thoughtful sort of things there. So I had to pick something good, but if they got a good one-liner, I'd give them inspiration. So what was neat about that was when they would go back to roll for the armies battling outside, they had to really very carefully choose who was going to use the inspiration on which one, which army was most important. So I was very pleased with this result. It did have the epic feeling. And just one more thing, again, I won't tell you about how the battle went for our particular party, but I will say, although I might do that in a future episode, I will say this, though, the way the adventure is constructed is that Tiamat, it really is anticlimactic, and every DM that's tried this has said this. It would be very anticlimactic if the heroes didn't actually get Tiamat to fight Tiamat, right? If you just prevent the summoning, it wouldn't be quite as cool as actually getting to fight the Mother of Dragons herself. So the module was also constructed with this concept in mind. So in the back of the book, they give you the stats for Tiamat. She's a child of level 30, so out of the box, pretty much no party is probably going to be able to defeat her, which is great, as she is the Mother of Dragons. So instead, what they do is, there's then, though, a list of things the party may have done throughout the entire campaign, or even during that final battle, that would impose weaknesses upon Tiamat. So, for example, out of the box, Tiamat has regeneration. She heals 30 hit points a round. But if you've managed to prevent one of the masks, for example, one of the key summoning items to be used, that ability goes away. Or Tiamat is immune to all spells below 6th level. But if you manage to do this other thing, that ability goes away. So they give you a list of things the party might have been able to pull off. And then those impose weaknesses on Tiamat. And if all those weaknesses are in place, it's not a gimme, but Tiamat is at least severely damageable, right? So you could actually beat her, but it's just going to be close, which I really liked. I thought that was a really clever idea to make a climactic battle and do that. And I actually imposed some of my own restrictions on Tiamat based on the cleverness of the party and some of the things they tried to do. So, for example, one of the party members is like, what if we were to use the disintegration spell on part of that gate? And they were like, well, it's magical. It may not auto work. If they had pulled that off, I would have made Tiamat summoning even weaker. Or if you managed to kill a lot of the summoning wizards before Tiamat's actually summoned, forcing them Tiamat to enter the world too soon, she comes in weaker as well. So things like that. So it's really cool. And so the party, one of the things though is that the party doesn't know that. So they started to get a little bit, I could tell they were a little frustrated, like, is there any way we're going to stop her? They're going to stop her anyway. What are we going to do? And so I started getting little hints, like as they would do things that would weaken Tiamat, I would have the different colors of the temple, the various shades, started to weaken or become less bright. If they did something, for example, like killed the blue worm speaker, the blue worm speaker's color would start to fade. Or if they kept the blue mask from being used in the summoning ritual, that would start to fade. I would let them know that they could see Tiamat's form sort of floating outside the portal as she was getting closer, and I would make little references to the fact that, oh, it looks like she got hurt, or she winced in pain. So I was trying to show them that they were like doing things and messing with her. And then when they were getting ready to kill the main, some of the main wizards that were being summoned, I started having the wizards say, just call her now. And the wizard's like, it's too soon. She will not be happy with us. And I started to like make these hints that what they were doing, they were going to fight Tiamat, but they were definitely doing things that was going to cause trouble. And that really seemed to get the party excited too. Like they knew they were going to see that giant model on the table because I'd had it behind me the entire campaign sort of painted, or at least for the last couple of years since I got it. And they were kind of like, oh my God, Russ is going to get to use that model. But they also knew there would be a chance, and they would be weakened as well. So I'll share next time more about what my particular party did and some of the things. And I will say that the overall mechanics of this. So hopefully this gave you a really good idea of the mechanics of the final battle and how I did it. And I will say that every member of my players loved the mechanics of the final battle and the final scene. They really liked that scene. They really liked how I did the armies behind me on the screen, and they would roll each round for that. That was universally all blown away by that mechanic. So if you're thinking of running this for your players, that seemed to go over extremely well. And reach out to me if you want. I'll be happy to send you, I've already put them on Facebook and Twitter, but I'll be happy to send you screenshots of what I did so you get a clearer idea of that. The other thing that I will say is that the idea of making the platforms that the wizards stood on actually be sort of these floating sort of platforms. So that ended up being really fun because the early on, one of the wizards, one of the bad guy wizards on the platform, he saw the players sort of come in through their portal because they pass wall through the portal right next to where he was hovering. So he's on this platform, he sees them there, and he cast his spell to get them, but he rolled a natural 1. And so for fluff reasons, I said, well, the spell, he shoots down by mistake, and instead of shooting the floor, this platform he's floating on, and the entire platform starts to float a little bit and drift and wobble. And so that showed the party that there's these platforms, and that became really fun because they started to when you have party members of this level, all kinds of fun starts to ensue. So first of all, people started to dimension door around from platform to platform. So they would get across the way and they start shooting spells at each other, which is pretty cool. The most fun moment actually came from the party's wizard, Lucius, who had the idea, and it was such a great idea that I had to just let it happen. So the main red wizard bad guy, Wrath Mordor, they were focusing on him, and they had sort of caught him in this wall of fire on the ground. And so Wrath Mordor himself dimension doored up to one of the floating platforms as far from the party as he could be, so he could focus on summoning Tiamat. And he was over there with another one of the summoning mages floating on that platform. And what was fun was the wizard was like, what if I reverse gravity there? Would it send the platform smashing into the ceiling of the temple? And I was like, oh, that's so brilliant. I have to allow that. Sure. So I let so I had the guys on top, Wrath Mordor and the battle mages up there. They both made dexterity saves to see if they could somehow roll off and escape the platform before it smashed into the ceiling. Of course, they both failed. They were pinned up there. They took essentially falling damage for falling that many feet up to the ceiling. And then they took additional damage from the platform itself smashing into them. And then, of course, there was a guy on the ground, like under the platform. And so gravity reversed for him as well. And he flew all the way up and slammed into the ceiling. But the best part about it was their wizard Lucius kept the platform pushed against the ceiling. And I had Wrath Mordor and one of the wizards there trying to make strength checks to push themselves out from under the squishing platform. And they just couldn't do it for a little while. So they're pinned there until finally the wizard let them drop. for another amount of falling damage. It was pretty hilarious. So it did end up being fun having the floating platform. So if you do go this route, I think you'll find the floating platforms add an additional tactical fun bit as well. So there you have it. That's my long-winded explanation for the lead up to some of the technology and tools and the way and the approach I took to running the grand finale for Tiamat and the Tyranny of Dragons campaign. As I mentioned, the actual mechanics of the finale were very well received. But I also had a really sort of crazy plot twist in there that was not. So I'd love to share that with you guys later, but that had nothing to do with the mechanics of the finale. If I were to do this again, I would run the finale the exact same way in terms of the mechanics of the combat and the way the temple was set up, because I thought it was really neat. And I think I'm going to try more of this. I'm going to try more of this like height-based, this sort of three-dimensional combat in Dungeons and Dragons. Now that I've got all these acrylic pillars built, I got to do something with them. So I think I might try that more there, as well as, of course, maybe slip them into some miniature war games occasionally as I have opportunities to do so. So there you have it. That was the finale from Finale Friday of Tyranny of Dragons.
Achievement unlocked! You've made it to the end of another D6 Generation episode, the podcast whose humor has universally been acclaimed as not too horrible. Please let us know what you thought of the show by emailing us at info@d6generation.com. If for some inexplicable reason you actually enjoyed this show, you can help others find out about it by leaving positive reviews on iTunes. Thanks for listening and happy gaming.